Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. This month's episode, as well as next month's, are going to be somewhat different. And the things I'll be discussing today deal with material that on the surface doesn't seem connected. So the stuff I'm going to be covering today is very strange and very complex. And I find myself struggling to create a sense of order in the chaos, so to speak, with regards to how I bring this information to you. So I hope you'll bear with me as I go along. If you recall, in episode 4, I interviewed Robert Cabrales about hyperstition, or in other words, fictions that become real. Afterwards, Robert messaged me with a link to a 2-part documentary series called Hellier. I started watching it and was instantly hooked. I contacted my friend and colleague Thomas van Breda, who I interviewed about Crowley in episode 1, and told him all about it. So the three of us got to talking about the show and all of the occult angles of it, and I mentioned something to the extent of, wouldn't it be fun to have a mini roundtable discussion about this show? And that's how all of this came to be. We wanted to discuss this show and this type of phenomena from a researcher's perspective, but didn't really want to explain all the details of the show. But as Thomas, Robert, and I looked deeper into Hellier, so much other stuff kept getting added to the story. And I realized that recording our discussion and then uploading it as my next podcast episode would be quite confusing to my listeners because most of you probably wouldn't know what the hell we were talking about. So this episode is going to try to lay a foundation for the upcoming mini roundtable discussion. I'm going to try to give you enough information that you'll be on board with the broader upcoming discussion. And of course, you're most welcome to go watch the show and research all of this stuff ahead of time too. But for those who don't have the time or inclination, this episode will attempt to bring everyone up to speed. Okay, we'll start with Hellier. This documentary, in multiple episodes that took several years to film, follows a team of paranormal researchers as they investigate an event or series of events that originally occurred in Hellier, Kentucky. One of the members, Greg Newkirk, received an email in 2012 from a distraught man named Dr. David Christie, who described being harassed by small humanoid, goblin-like creatures that were assumed to be coming out of the nearby caves and tunnels. This part of Kentucky is right in the middle of the Mammoth Cave System area, so there are caves everywhere and also tunnels from all of the mining that took place in that area. The thing that made this email odd was that it was sent to a basically defunct website that Greg had created years ago when he was a teenager with a group of his friends. He kept the site open, but only occasionally checked it for any activity. Additionally, this Dr. Christie said that a friend of his named Terry Wriste, spelled W-R-I-S-T-E, was a mutual acquaintance of theirs, and that Terry told the doctor to contact Greg for help. And Greg was confused as he didn't know anyone named Terry Wriste. In any case, Greg asked Dr. Christie in email if he could supply him with some evidence to let him know that this wasn't just some kind of hoax. So Dr. Christie obliged and sent photographs of 3-toed footprints, kind of muddy footprints, and blurry photos of the supposed creatures. And after some back and forth emails, Dr. Christie said that the harassment was getting out of hand and that he and his family were feeling unsafe and were going to be leaving the area because of it rather abruptly. So shortly after that, Dr. Christie disappeared, so to speak, and stopped communicating with Greg. Later on, when the team was trying to find this man, they found out that no records exist of anyone living in Hellier by that name. But let's pause here for a moment to mention that this area that we're talking about is known for its strange occurrences, with the 1955 Kelly Hopkinsville case probably being one of the most well-known. That case was also an account of a family who were besieged, I guess, by what they call little green men, later thought to be extraterrestrials. So back to Hellier. Sometime later, Terry Rist himself emailed Greg with oddly worded and oddly spelled messages that include phrases such as the ink and the black, references to a third order, and included in all this was a 16-digit string of numbers that were assumed by Greg and his wife Dana, who was also a member of the research team, to be GPS coordinates of an area near Brown Mountain, North Carolina, where Greg and Dana had visited in 2012. So, wondering who this man was, Greg put Terry Rist's name in Google in the search engine, and the only thing that came up was a reference to a book by Alan Greenfield called The Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts. So who's this guy? Okay, so as you can probably deduce by the title of the book, Greenfield is a ufologist, but he's also an occultist and a practicing ceremonial magician who was a member of the OTO. And the Ordo Templi Orientis, of course, has ties to Aleister Crowley and Thelema. So what Greenfield says he's attempting in the book, in his words, quote, to interpret the lore of ufology for occultists, end quote, and vice versa. So interpreting occultism for ufologists. And his book about the secret cipher is based upon concepts that are used within Thelema regarding gematria. And gematria, in a nutshell, the idea that numbers can be seen as a sort of code. So each number has a letter of the alphabet associated with it, and therefore words can be made out of numbers or strings of numbers, and that cracking the number code will give you a hidden message in words. So that's kind of my basic explanation of it. Incidentally, if you want more concise information about Greenfield, gematria, and Hellier, check out episode number 67 of the Weird Studies podcast. They give a really nice and quick explanation of it and just a good discussion in general. So I read Greenfield's books, The Secret Cipher that I just mentioned, and most of his follow-up book called The Secret Rituals of the Men in Black, as part of my own research for this episode and the next one. These two books now, by the way, are compiled in the recent Complete Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts, just so you know. So allow me to give a little summary of the stuff Greenfield talks about. He thinks that people like Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society, Aleister Crowley, and some members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as the Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO, have a connection to ufology. He calls them secret agents, and this is what he and Terry Rist mean by the third order that I mentioned before. What it appears he's drawing upon is the theosophical concept of Mahatmas, or magical secret chiefs, or adepts that are, and I'm just paraphrasing here what he said, a sort of priesthood that protect the secrets of the divine visitors. So he's operating on the basis that our planet was visited long ago by extraterrestrials or other entities, and that this priesthood needed to develop things like secret oaths, secret signs, and ciphers, etc., to be able to communicate with each other safely. Greenfield speaks about our cosmos and our world manifesting out of quote unquote an ultimate not thing or nothing. Again, paraphrasing, this process of manifestations of energies or higher intelligences can become more mundane and closer to what we think of as good and evil in our general idea of reality, even though these intelligences may appear still to be very powerful divine entities to us. Greenfield separates these good and evil energies into white and black lodges. And these colors should not be confused or conflated with ethnicity or race, but he's speaking in terms of the energies and their purposes. So he links the men in black of UFO lore to the Black Lodge, and these MIBs are in opposition to, quote unquote, the Great White Brotherhood, aka the White Lodge. And he explains that these two entities are in constant conflict with each other. They are at war with each other. Quoting from page 63 of the complete Secret Cipher, the Black Lodge may be defined as the organized institution for the purpose of holding back human evolution and keeping a slave mentality in place. And he states further on page 65 that, quote, fallen and failed adepts have become tools and pawns of the Black Lodge, end quote. And curiously, he mentions L. Ron Hubbard in this list. So put a pin in that for later. Greenfield also mentions the book The Morning of the Magicians by Powell and Bergier, linking groups like the Vril Society, the Vril, V-R-I-L, Vril Society, and the Thule group, Thule, T-H-U-L-E, from World War II Germany to the Black Lodge as well. And The Morning of the Magicians, this book is a mix of historical fact and lore, according to historians of Western esotericism, but it could also be seen as an example of hyperstition, in my opinion. Now, let's move on to Terry Wrist. The Hellier team spoke with a man who claims to have met Terry Wrist when the man was a teenager, and says that Wrist had a military background and a keen interest in esoteric subjects. Greenfield's book contains an interview with Wrist, but doesn't really give any background information as to why this man is interviewed. What I can gather from the interviews that are contained in the book, Greenfield suspects that Wrist is a secret chief. And although Wrist kind of scoffs at that idea, it is clear that the man knows quite a bit about the high strangeness going on in the region of Kentucky, North Carolina, and West Virginia, that area in the United States, including knowledge of the cave systems there, also claims of underground cities and little humanoid creatures, as well as knowledge of how to use the cipher and some of the most secret thelemic rituals. He also seems to know a lot about the Mothman angle, and he claims to have found Indrid Cold in the flesh. If you recall, he mentioned the phrase ink and black in Greg's email. Now, for those who are experts on UFO lore, which I'm not, the phrase ink and black is a code name for Indrid Cold, who plays a large role in the famous Mothman incidents of 1966 in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Indrid Cold was allegedly an extraterrestrial who was stranded on Earth, and whom the author and paranormal investigator John Keel wrote about in his book, The Mothman Prophecies. These two places in Kentucky and West Virginia are not that far apart, about 180 miles give or take. So the Hellier team started to think that the clues that Terry Wrist was giving them had something to do with Indrid Cold and the whole Mothman incident. Now, as the team really had no knowledge or experience with occult rituals or practices such as were being referred to by Alan Greenfield and those found within Thelema, the group decided instead to perform a number of experiments using the Estes method and the God helmet to try to contact any entities out there in order to get more information about what was going on and what they could do to investigate all of this. So what are those things that I just mentioned? The Estes method makes use of a spirit box, which is a device that uses radio frequencies to contact spirits, basically. The person involved in the experiment is blindfolded and wears noise-canceling headphones so that they only hear the radio frequencies coming through the spirit box. So what you hear are random bursts of sound, such as you would get when you turn the dial on an old-fashioned radio. The God helmet, also known as the Gansfeld experiments, is used by placing electromagnets on the head that generate weak magnetic fields that stimulate the temporal lobes of the brain. And these fields induce an altered state of consciousness. This is very similar to what people who have had religious or mystical experiences report to feel. So they use those two devices. The results of their experiments weren't super clear to them. They seemed intriguing, but not really clear. As time went on, though, the name Parsons kept cropping up, as well as the idea that something old was present, but kind of sleeping or waiting for the team to find it. And the term synchronicity kept coming up over and over again, actually. They start by talking about this because so many things kept happening in the course of their investigation that seemed to be more than just random coincidences. And there was, for all of them, this deeper meaning behind it all. They were also struggling with the question of whether or not Terry Wrist was an actual person. For example, Terry Wrist could be another way of writing or saying terrorist. But they also wondered whether or not Terry Wrist was actually Alan Greenfield, that Greenfield made this guy up. In any case, in season 2, the team started to travel to other cities such as Ashland and Somerset, Kentucky, to try to establish whether or not the persons known as Terry Wrist and Indrid Cold were quote-unquote actual people with a physical history. In doing so, they met and interviewed a man named Nathan Isaac in Somerset, Kentucky, who is working on his own independent project involving paranormal and anomalous activities in that area called the Penny Royal. Okay, here's where this whole thing kind of goes off into left field and gets very messy, I guess you could say. It involves both the Hellier team and Nathan Isaac's Penny Royal project. So let's leave Hellier for the time being and talk about Penny Royal. The messy stuff will come up as I talk about this. Nathan Isaac's podcast called Pennyroyal focuses on the Pennyroyal area, which is a region in Kentucky's Appalachian Mountains that includes the Mammoth Cave system and basically the same area that the Hellier team was investigating. While I won't go into the minute details of this entire podcast, Nathan does bring up some very interesting questions and observations. So let's start with the questions. When looking at incidents of high strangeness, Nathan asks, can places have an effect on people, and can people have an effect on places? He notes the weird phenomena that has occurred in the area over years. The meat shower of 1876, when pieces of something that looked like meat fell from the sky. They said it tasted like mutton, strangely enough. Also, numerous accounts of werewolves, humanoids, strange objects in the sky, animal attacks and mutilations. Nathan notes that it was the belief of the famous occultist Kenneth Grant that Native American peoples, such as the Adena and Hopewell tribes, who resided in that area, had performed rituals that included scrying and ingesting psychedelic plants, and in doing so opened a gateway into the abyss, or what Grant called the night side of the tree of life. And that this gateway was never closed afterwards, after these rituals. Additionally mentioned is the story that Aleister Crowley also opened a gateway during his own ritual with the entity known as Lamb. And Nathan asks, could these account for all of the weird occurrences? Additionally, the area is covered in quartz agate. There are deposits everywhere. And quartz can act as a conductor of electric charges. And pair this with NASA data showing that Somerset is a hotspot of electromagnetic energy. One, of course, would wonder what the effects of electromagnetic energy or fields would have on people and their brains. Can this be related perhaps to violence, psychosis, suicides? Nathan purports that he has read research that suggests a connection or a correlation. And now we get to the kind of messy part. In both the Hellier documentary and the Pennyroyal podcast, the topic of mental illness comes up. The Hellier team, for example, was told by a city official that Ashland, Kentucky, has a serious mental health problem. And Nathan of Pennyroyal notes the violent history of that area, along with a scandal involving a prominent mental health facility in the 1970s. I'll come back to that last point. In season 2, Greg of the Hellier team receives yet another email asking for help, this time from a woman named Amy, who talked about the little green men in the caves, but added to the high strangeness a fantastic tale of murders, government and military involvement, occult practices, I mean, you name it, everything, and the kitchen sink was included in this story. And this time, however, Amy is an actual person. She is in jail, charged with multiple felonies, but she is quote unquote real. They talk to her, they see her. She claims she's kind of pressed for time when she's talking over the prison telephone, but in her hurried statements, she claims that someone named Doug, with Doug being an alias, told her to contact Greg because, again, Greg is like, why are you contacting me of all people? So this led them to think that Doug was, in fact, Terry Wrist. Okay, jumping back to Pennyroyal, about the scandal involving the mental health facility I just mentioned. It included allegations that the third shift faculty was part of a witch cult, as they called it, performing rituals in the tunnels beneath the facility that included sex and drug parties. An official investigation was started when a patient was found dead in a pond on the premises. And note that this incident is before the whole satanic panic period of the 1980s and 90s. However, Nathan was also contacted by a woman who claimed to be a victim of satanic ritual abuse, inflicted upon her by members of a devil-worshipping organized crime group that included drug and prostitution rings. She also attested to seeing murders as well as strange creatures in the caves where she was taken. And additionally, she offered during the conversation that she was in therapy and that her quote-unquote memories have come back, which suggests to me that hypnosis might have been used. Okay, jumping back to Hellier, Greg and Dana conducted, with the help of a hypnotist, an alien abduction experiment and asked a friend of theirs to participate who claimed he didn't believe in aliens when they started the experiment. And the purpose of the experiment was to test the hypothesis that a non-physical aspect of abduction experiences can exist. So you don't actually have to physically be taken anywhere, but that it can happen in your mind, so to speak. So after the hypnosis session, the friend said that he now believes in aliens and the possibility of abductions and feels very uneasy whenever this topic comes up. Oddly enough, though, he has no memory of the entire experiment. So this led Greg and Dana to wonder if they had uncovered something that had actually happened to him. On the other hand, though, the hypnotist stated, quote, "false memories are easy to create," end quote, and that there is a danger to irresponsible regression. Yet, Greg and Dana didn't seem to think that their friends' memories were implanted. I'm not so sure. I'm just putting that out there. I have my doubts about the effectiveness of hypnosis, especially when you're dealing with trauma. And then to add the whole mental illness aspect to this mix, I don't know. It's not to say that if a person is suffering from a mental illness, that it invalidates experiences of high strangeness, or that the events the person claims to have occurred didn't occur. However, it's pretty well known by now that both in alleged cases of satanic ritual abuse, and think here on the book Michelle Remembers, and UFO abductions, think on the Emma Woods case and David Jacobs using hypnosis on her. The use of hypnosis for memory retrieval is contested by many people and is a sticky subject, to say the least. Plus, I would think it would be difficult to proceed in a respectful and safe manner with one's research or investigations when you have a suspicion that you might be dealing with someone with a mental illness or who might be suffering from the effects of trauma. I mean, how does one proceed in a responsible, ethical manner that is sensitive to the needs of the person you're involved with? And these are just my own questions that arise when I think on this. And this wasn't brought up in the show. But as for the Hellier team and Amy, it was clear that they felt completely out of their depth with regards to her claims. They are paranormal investigators looking into sightings of Bigfoot, ghosts, and haunted places, not crime syndicates and murders and that type of thing. That needed to be handed over to the appropriate authorities, in their opinion. And yet there's all of this high strangeness that's all interwoven into this that can't be ignored either. So, yeah, as you can see, this is a huge ball of yarn that is just incredibly tangled. Let's move on to the observations that Nathan Isaac makes in Pennyroyal. With regard to all this messy stuff, Nathan notices that there is a, quote, paranormal layer that seems to have ties to far-reaching conspiracy shit, end quote, and that concepts like the satanic panic, quote, creates a perspective for you to see these things, end quote. And I would tend to agree with this. Nathan also mentions George Hansen's idea of the trickster phenomena, referring to a comment by Jeff Ritzman, who, by the way, I used to listen to all the time. I don't know, about, is that 10 years ago now? Or maybe not even that long, 8-9 years ago, when he had his Paratopia podcast together with Jeremy Vaeni. Ritzman brought up George Hansen all the time. Oh, and you can find out more about the Emma Woods discussion there too. That's where I heard about it the first time around. Anyway, Hansen talks about the tricksters and the possibility of all this being a cosmic joke. There are all of these theories out there, but none of these, it's none of these things is basically what he's saying. Whatever this is, it's just toying with us, according to Hansen. Nathan observes that it's difficult for most people to accept magical things or the idea of the other, and how people have the tendency to ask, well, what's real then? Is it all just fake? Yet that doesn't seem like the right questions. As Nathan suggests, perhaps we should be aware of who is trying to control the narrative, if possible, as a lot of this seems to be a mixture of truth and lies. There does seem to be a deceptive nature to this stuff, and doubt is the means to manipulate others. It can also seem very spooky and dangerous, and fear can be a powerful tool of manipulation too. But I mean, the whole good versus evil dualism that this implies bothers me to some extent. But when asking what is reality then, one way of looking at it is that it's like a movie projected inside your head. And outside of that is everything else. A bigger world that we can't see, but that can see us. So it's the interaction with this bigger other that we often have difficulty processing. In Nathan's discussion with his guest, Richard Spence, they note that all of the esoteric systems in the world offer the possibility of awareness and knowledge of this larger other world, that magic seems to be at the heart of all of this, and that this has been happening since the beginning of time as we know it. And speaking of time, magic is outside of time as well as outside of space. So there seems to be this other place that is aware of us, but that we normally don't notice because we are in time and space. And magic, in this sense, is basically second-order cybernetics, according to Nathan. And cybernetics, if you recall, is the study of how systems interact with each other. So we can be observing the system or the other in the first order, but the second order is the system or the other observing the observer in action. High strangeness seems to occur more and seems to interfere more often with someone when they start interacting with the other. Additionally, Nathan suggests that there might be places or areas on Earth that might be more permeable due to their particular electromagnetic energies, allowing for distortions of space and time. And we could see these places as being liminal spaces or in between spaces where the other can then leak through. So getting back to Hellier, in the last episode of season 2, one of the team members gets some help from a man named John Tenney, who is an investigator of occult phenomena in the United States, to try to help figure out what the 16-digit string of numbers was all about. It turns out that this was not GPS coordinates as Greg had suspected, but that they were numbers that needed to be put through this secret cipher to extract a message. Now, I won't give away what the message is, but suffice it to say, it was something that RIST wanted the Hellier team to look into the whole time they'd been investigating. And this had been years by now. And it has to do with something taken from Thelema that the Hellier team had no idea about what it was or how to even use it. And this really confused me because why would Terry Rist go to such extremes to encode a message to the Hellier team when they had no experience with the cipher or any connection to Thelema? I don't know. In any case, the team was obviously learning new things. So I guess that's good. And felt in the end that they weren't finished yet, but that they're involved in a process pointing to a much bigger phenomena. When I was watching Hellier, listening to Penny Royal, and doing all of my reading and researching, something that struck me was the uncanny similarities of all of this stuff to the fictional story of Twin Peaks, created by David Lynch and Mark Frost. The aesthetics of Hellier reminded me often of Twin Peaks. The events of Penny Royal reminded me of Twin Peaks, and the team at Penny Royal brought the show up quite often in their conversations. And even the Weird Studies podcast episode I mentioned earlier discusses the similarities. I mean, I was listening to that podcast after all of this, and I was, struck by, even they were noticing this. Interestingly, the big picture of Twin Peaks ties into a lot of what Alan Greenfield and Penny Royal talk about. Now, I'm a huge fan of Twin Peaks, total nerd. I have both books that Mark Frost wrote to accompany the show, so I reread them to refresh my mind as to all the stuff they contain. So let me just list several things here. We have black and white lodges located in other dimensions, liminal spaces, gateways, the shifting of time and space, time travel, strange occurrences, mysterious beings, abductions and disappearances, occult symbolism, covert government operations, plus all the other things that seem to be connected to these phenomena: violence, mental illness, and criminal activities. That is, drug rings, prostitution rings, child abuse, murders, and then later an entire crime syndicate that Evil Cooper sets up in The Return. Of course, the focus is on the evil side of all of this, and that does seem to play into many people's suspicions about the occult and magic. Plus, there is a focus on the effects on people and places after the nuclear bomb explosion in 1945 at White Sands, New Mexico. Additionally, the concept of tulpas is introduced. Put a pin in that for later. If you get deeper into the books, the magical rituals of Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard are discussed. So add Crowley and Thelema to the mix too, although it's not shown in a particularly good light, which seems to be the case with the occult, as if it is assumed that anyone involved in a secret society and magical practices is up to no good. Okay, so if we look back at all the stuff that I've been talking about in this episode and think of all of the different events and ideas and people as threads, I guess you could say, then what jumps out at me is how all of these things seem to be woven together or blended. The blending of actual historical figures and events of high strangeness or covert activities with actual occultists like Parsons and Crowley, together with actual and virtual or fictional accounts of high strangeness and covert activities. So much so that there really is no separating all the tightly woven threads. So in the next episode, I'll most likely be bringing some of this stuff back up as talking points into the conversation, as there is a lot more that can be considered with regard to tulpas, for example, or what the magical practices of Thelema are really getting at. Okay, I think that's it for this time. I think I threw enough at you. Next time, I'll be joined by Thomas and Robert, and we'll be expanding our discussion to include the questions of how do you study this stuff as researchers in religious studies? How to deal with the limitations and challenges when it comes to studying these phenomena? Can we come up with new ideas and concepts to use in order to study this? Why Hellier is relevant for the study of Western esotericism and more broadly religion? How the existence of shows like this relate to the concept of a culture that I mentioned in episode 1, or the introductory episode, I should say, and the discussion around disenchantment and reenchantment. And what does this show and others like it do to us, do for us, and do with us? So, we're going to try to cover these questions at least. I hope we can get to all of them. I'm looking forward to the roundtable discussion and how it unfolds. So I hope you'll join us next time. Thanks for listening.